My daughter-in-law tried to steal my 15 restaurants while I mourned my dead wife. But when she forged my will to take millions, my daughter exposed her as a professional scammer, and now she's in prison. I'm 57 years old. I own 15 restaurants on the East Coast, and 6 months ago I lost my wife to cancer. I thought that was going to be the worst moment of my life, but it turns out my daughter-in-law had other plans and basically tried to steal everything from me while I was grieving. And when I say everything, I mean everything: the house, the businesses, even the bank accounts. The thing is, this woman, Brittany, it turns out she wasn't just your run-of-the-mill opportunist. No, she was a professional at this. Like she had done the same thing in 2 other states before landing on my family. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story is so absurd that if I don't tell it in order, nobody's going to believe me. I built my restaurant empire from scratch, literally from scratch. I started washing dishes when I was like 27 years old, without a penny in my pocket, and for 30 years, I worked like an animal to get to where I am. My wife, Margaret, was with me from the beginning, when we only had one small restaurant that barely gave us enough to pay rent. She handled the finances. I cooked and managed, and together we turned that place into a chain of 15 restaurants. That's worth, well, let's just say it's worth quite a bit. We had 2 kids, Matthew, who's now 31 and works in pharmaceutical sales, and our daughter, who's 28 and works in bank compliance, which is going to be important later. You'll see why. Matthew met Brittany like 3 years ago, maybe a little more. She was 28 at the time, already came with 2 kids from a previous marriage, Ava and Liam, who are now 8 and 10. From the beginning, something sounded off about her to me. I don't know. There was something about the way she always asked about the business, about how much the restaurants were worth, about our properties. Margaret told me I was being paranoid, that the girl was just trying to get to know the family. But I don't know. My gut was telling me there was something more. Brittany was one of those people who ask questions that sound casual, but are actually mining for information. You know what I mean? Like, oh, what a nice house you have. How much does a property like this cost around here? Or, wow, 15 restaurants, that must be worth millions, right? Things like that make you uncomfortable, but you can't pinpoint exactly why. They got married 2 years ago, a big wedding that we paid for because Matthew wanted to give her and the kids everything. We spent like $80,000 on that wedding. I remember it perfectly because Margaret and I argued about whether it was too much. But in the end we said, well, he's our only son. Let's do it right. Brittany invited a bunch of people we didn't even know. And I remember during the reception, she was more interested in talking to my accountant and my lawyer than dancing with her husband. I should have seen that as a giant red flag, but I was so happy for Matthew that I ignored part of it. After the wedding, Brittany started showing up at our house more often. She always had some excuse, that she needed advice about something, that the kids wanted to see their grandparents, that Matthew was working, and she felt lonely. Margaret received her with open arms, because that's how she was. My wife was the most generous person in the world, always saw the best in everyone. But I noticed things, like how Brittany always found a way to be alone in the house, or how she asked questions about our will, about how we had structured the inheritance, about whether we had trusts. One time, I found her in my home office, literally standing in front of my filing cabinet, and when I asked her what she was doing there, she told me she was looking for the bathroom. The bathroom. Seriously. As if she didn't know where it was after being in my house like 50 times, and then everything changed when Margaret got sick. It was so fast, so brutal, that I still can't process it well. One day, she was fine. The next day, she was diagnosed with aggressive stage 4 cancer, and 3 months later, she was gone. 3 months. We didn't even have time to process what was happening. During those 3 months, Brittany was there all the time, supposedly helping. But now looking back, I realized she was positioning herself. She offered to organize Margaret's medical appointments, to handle some payments, to help with the insurance paperwork. Margaret was so weak that she accepted any help, and I was so destroyed watching my wife die that I didn't pay attention to what Brittany was actually doing. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning at the hospital. I was holding her hand. Both of our kids were there, and Brittany was also in the room with the children. My wife had been my partner for 32 years, the mother of my children, my business partner, my best friend, and suddenly she was gone. I can't even describe that pain. It's like someone rips a part of you out and you have to keep living anyway. The funeral was 2 days later. 500 people came, restaurant employees, friends, family, regular customers. Brittany was there the whole time, crying louder than anyone, hugging people, telling everyone how much she loved Margaret. I was so immersed in my grief that I didn't even bother to question why she was acting like she was her daughter instead of just her daughter-in-law. Matthew was devastated too. He and his mother were very close, so we were all in our own world of suffering. It's not that I hadn't thought about it before, but Margaret and I had always planned to review our documents together when necessary, and now that she was gone, I had to do it alone. My lawyer helped me structure everything so that my 2 biological children would receive the majority of the inheritance, the restaurants, the properties, the investments, all of that. For Ava and Liam, Brittany's kids, I set up educational trusts of $50,000 each because, well, they're my son's stepkids and I wanted to make sure they had something for college. It seemed fair to me, generous even, considering they weren't my biological grandchildren and Brittany had only been in the family for 2 years. I didn't tell anyone about the will immediately. I was going to mention it at some point when the timing was right, but honestly I was so tired, so empty, that I just didn't have the energy for conversations about money and inheritances. I kept working at the restaurants because I needed to keep busy, but everything felt mechanical, like I was on autopilot. Brittany showed up at my house like 2 weeks after the funeral. Matthew was on a work trip, the kids were at school, and she said she needed to talk to me about something important. And then, without any preamble, she asked me directly how much Matthew was going to inherit when I died. That direct? Like, how much is there and when are we going to get it? I was so surprised that I didn't know what to say for a moment. I told her that was private, that it wasn't appropriate to discuss, but she insisted. She told me that as Matthew's wife she had a right to know, that they were planning their future, that they needed that information to make decisions. I explained, trying to stay calm, that I had updated my will and that my 2 biological children would receive equal parts of everything, and that I had set up educational trusts for Ava and Liam. And that's when her mask fell off. Her face changed completely, like 0 to 100 in a second, and she started screaming that this was discrimination, that her children were as much part of the family as any other grandchild, that Matthew was going to divorce her if I didn't change the will to include them equally. I tried to reason with her, told her that $50,000 was a lot of money for education, that they weren't my biological grandchildren, but she didn't want to hear any of it. And then she dropped the bomb. She told me she was pregnant, that she was going to have my biological grandchild, and that if I didn't change the will immediately to divide everything equally among all the children, including Ava and Liam, she was going to make sure I never met that baby. She literally threatened me with my own grandchild, using her pregnancy as blackmail to change my will. I sat there, looking at her, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman had just revealed exactly who she was, and it was ugly, really ugly. I told her to leave my house. She stood up, pointed her finger at me, and told me I was going to regret this. That she was going to make sure the whole family knew what kind of horrible and discriminatory father-in-law I was. She left. Slamming the door so hard, I thought she was going to break the door frame. The next day, the Facebook posts started. Brittany wrote this long, dramatic post about how her father-in-law had just lost his wife, but was already discriminating against her stepchildren in his will, about how he only loved his biological grandchildren, about how she was pregnant but her baby was going to grow up knowing that his grandfather didn't love his half-siblings. She tagged a bunch of relatives, friends, everyone. My phone immediately started ringing with cousins, uncles, Margaret's friends, asking me if it was true, telling me I was being unfair, that I should treat all children equally. My daughter was the first to come defend me. She read the post, called Brittany directly, and told her to stop manipulating the situation, that the educational trusts were generous considering Ava and Liam weren't biological grandchildren. Brittany hung up on her, and then posted another post about how my daughter was also part of the problem, about how our whole family was elitist and horrible. It was a complete circus. Public drama about something that should have been private. Matthew called me that night. He was confused, upset, caught in the middle. He told me Brittany was crying all the time, that she said I hated her, that I didn't want her children. I tried to explain my side, but I could hear Brittany in the background yelling things, and Matthew basically told me he needed time to think. My own son, choosing to believe his manipulative wife over his father. The following weeks were a nightmare. Brittany continued her social media campaign called Employees at My Restaurants, trying to get information about the business finances, even contacted my accountant pretending I had asked her to call. My accountant, who has worked with me for 15 years, immediately called me to verify, and when I told him I had no idea what she was talking about, we started putting security measures on all my financial documents. But here's where things got really crazy. I started noticing that things were missing from my house. Small things. At first, documents from my office that were moved or gone, copies of bank statements that I kept in a filing cabinet, even some of Margaret's jewelry that I had left on her dresser. Brittany had a copy of the key to my house because Margaret had given it to her for emergencies, and I never thought to ask for it back after the funeral. My daughter, who works in bank compliance as I mentioned, suggested I install security cameras. At first it seemed extreme to me, but after thinking about it, I decided to do it. I hired a company to install discrete cameras throughout the house, especially in my office, at the entrances, in the living room. I didn't tell anyone about the cameras, they just installed them and started recording everything. 2 days later, the cameras caught Brittany entering my house in the middle of the day when I was at the restaurant. She used her key, went straight to my office, and spent like 45 minutes scanning documents with her phone. Documents from my filing cabinet, copies of my will that I had stored there, financial statements from the restaurants, property papers, everything. I watched her on the video, standing there calmly, taking pictures of everything with her phone like it was the most normal thing in the world. I called my lawyer immediately, showed him the videos, and he told me this was enough for a restraining order and possibly criminal charges. But he suggested waiting, seeing what else she did, building a stronger case. So I waited and kept recording. A week later, my daughter received an alert from her work. Someone had tried to use my identity documents to open trust accounts at the bank where she worked. The attempt was flagged by the security system because the signatures didn't match correctly with what they had on file. My daughter reviewed the application and almost fell off her chair. The signatures were forged, obviously, but they were good enough to fool an untrained teller. They had tried to create 3 trust accounts, one for each of Brittany's children and one for the baby she was expecting, with instructions to automatically transfer funds from my business accounts. My daughter copied all the documentation, reported it to her supervisor, and sent it to me. I took everything to my lawyer, along with the videos of Brittany in my house, and he basically told me we had enough evidence to completely ruin this woman. Bank fraud, forgery, identity theft, illegal entry to private property, it was all there, but we waited a bit longer because my lawyer wanted to see if there was more. And of course there was. Matthew finally came to talk to me like 3 weeks after the will incident. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. He told me he had found something in the house, a notebook that Brittany kept in a box in her closet, and what was in that notebook basically destroyed his world. Brittany had been planning all of this since before she met Matthew. The notebook had dates, notes, strategies. She had literally written things like, research net worth of restaurant family, find single son, establish relationship, marriage within 18 months, wait for mother to die to push for will change. She had pages and pages of plans, including how she was going to manipulate Matthew, how she was going to win over Margaret, how she was going to isolate me from my family if I didn't cooperate. It was chilling, like Hollywood-level psychopath, but real. But the worst part, what really destroyed Matthew, was discovering she had done this before. The notebook had references to another man, an older man in Connecticut who had died 3 years earlier, whose family Brittany had tried to manipulate for inheritance. She had done the same thing in Virginia before that. Basically, this woman had a pattern of finding men with successful parents, marrying them, waiting for one of the parents to die, and then pushing for inheritance, using children as blackmail. Matthew was destroyed. He came to my house crying, with the notebook in hand, apologizing over and over. He showed me everything. every horrible page of Brittany's plans, and I could only sit there feeling sick. My son had been used, manipulated, turned into a tool for this woman's scheme. I showed Matthew the videos of Brittany in my house, told him about the bank fraud attempt, and he basically watched his entire marriage fall apart in front of him. He asked me what he should do, and I told him we needed to go to the police with everything. But before we could do that, Brittany escalated things completely. She showed up at my main restaurant, my flagship place, where I started 30 years ago. On a Thursday night when the place was packed, she was drunk, visibly pregnant at like 5 months, and started screaming in the middle of the dining room that I was a monster, that I was trying to take her children away, that I was going to destroy my family. Customers were staring, employees didn't know what to do, and Brittany kept screaming, knocked over some tables, threw wine glasses. It was a complete mess. My manager called the police, and when they arrived, Brittany tried to run but was too drunk and pregnant to move fast. The officers detained her for disorderly conduct, and when she tried to bribe them to let her go, they added attempted bribery to the charges. That night at the police station, my lawyer and I presented all the evidence we had. The videos, the notebook, the bank fraud documentation, everything. The police started a formal investigation, and they quickly discovered that Brittany had a record in 2 different states for similar schemes. She had never been convicted because the previous families had settled out of court, but the patterns were all there. Matthew filed for divorce the next morning and requested emergency custody of the unborn baby. Brittany was released on bail but with a restraining order that prohibited her from approaching me, my daughter, or any of my restaurants. She was also ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluation as a condition of bail. Criminal charges were filed: fraud, forgery, identity theft, illegal recording, because it turns out she had also installed listening devices in my house when Margaret was sick, illegal entry, attempted bribery, everything. My lawyer said she was potentially looking at years in prison if convicted of everything. The trial was a circus. Brittany hired a defense attorney who tried to argue that she was a desperate mother trying to secure her children's future, that I was a cruel father-in-law who had manipulated her. But the evidence was too solid. The notebook alone was damning. Combined with everything else, there was no way she could escape. Brittany gave birth to a beautiful baby boy in July. Matthew was at the hospital. I was there. My daughter, too. Brittany had an ankle monitor on, because by that point she had already been found guilty on some of the charges and was awaiting sentencing. It was surreal. This beautiful moment of my grandson's birth, tainted by all this craziness with his mother. The sentencing came 2 months later. She got 18 months in prison, which with good behavior would probably be like 90 days actual time, 5 years probation, mandatory psychiatric treatment, restitution of $50,000 to cover my legal costs and damages to my restaurant, and she was prohibited from contacting any member of my family except her own children under supervision. Matthew got primary custody of the baby. Brittany got supervised visitation twice a week. Her kids, Ava and Liam, well, that was complicated. Their biological father lives in another state and hasn't been very involved, so Matthew and I agreed that we would continue to be part of their lives because they weren't at fault for any of this. In fact, I kept the educational trusts for them because, at the end of the day, they're innocent children caught in their mother's mess. Now, like 6 months after all this, things are finally calming down. My grandson is almost 4 months old, and he's beautiful, perfect, and has no idea about the drama that surrounded his birth. Matthew is living with me temporarily while he sorts out his housing situation, and honestly, it's nice having my son and grandson in the house, even though the circumstances are horrible. The restaurants are doing better than ever, ironically. All the publicity, although it was negative at first, ended up attracting more customers who wanted to see the place where the drama happened. I don't recommend it as a marketing strategy, but it worked. Brittany served her 90 days, got out like 2 months ago, and is now in a halfway house completing her probation. She sees the baby twice a week at a supervised visitation center, and according to Matthew, she basically cries the whole time and says she's sorry. Whether she's really sorry or just sorry she got caught, I don't know. And honestly, I don't care. My daughter and I are closer than ever. She was my rock through all of this, and without her work at the bank, we probably wouldn't have caught the fraud so quickly. Matthew is in therapy, processing everything, trying to understand how he was so blindly manipulated, and I just support him the best I can. Sometimes I find myself sitting in the house at night, holding my grandson, and I think about Margaret and how she never got to meet this baby. She would have been an amazing grandmother, and it hurts that she was taken so young, so fast. But I also think about how she always trusted everyone, always saw the best in people, and I wonder if Brittany would have managed to do more damage if Margaret were still alive, because she never would have suspected anything. I guess in the end, this whole nightmare taught me to trust my instincts. From the beginning, something felt wrong about Brittany, and I was right. It also taught me that you can't underestimate how far some people are willing to go for money. That there are people out there who see families not as relationships, but as financial opportunities. And it taught me that real family, true family, sticks together even when everything is falling apart. My restaurants keep running. My family is healing. And I have this beautiful little baby, who's my grandson, and who's never going to know what his mother tried to do. Matthew is an amazing father. He's completely dedicated to that child, and between him, my daughter, and me, that baby is going to grow up surrounded by real love, not the kind of calculated manipulation that Brittany represented. Last week, Matthew asked me if I could ever forgive Brittany, not for her, but so he could move on. I told him the truth, that I don't know if I can forgive her for trying to destroy our family, for using her pregnancy as a weapon, for manipulating my son. But I also told him that I don't need to forgive her to move on with my life, that I've already let go of enough anger to function, and that's enough for now. He nodded and said he understood, and that's where the conversation stayed. So yeah, that's my story. About how my daughter-in-law turned out to be a professional scammer who tried to steal my restaurant empire while I was grieving for my wife. About how she almost succeeded because she was very good at what she did, she had practiced on other families before, and about how, in the end, real family, the kind based on real love and not manipulation, won. It's a bitter victory considering everything we lost in the process, but it's a victory nonetheless.